So I think we can get started here. Hello and welcome. Before we get into the details today, I'd like to acknowledge the injustice, anger, anxiety, and pain that so many in our community and country and world are feeling right now. So much of what exists has been built on top of a flawed and unjust system. There's not much more to say. But we must continue on. And today we hope to focus on tools and strategies that can be applied to what might come next, to the ways that art and design and entrepreneurship can be a part of the change we must bring to the world. As many of you know, this conversation is part of Art Center's BOLD programs. Since the pandemic, we've shifted to move these online and bring you conversations and deep dives in certain areas connected to business and entrepreneurship, relevant to what we're going through as a community and a world with all that is changed and all that is coming next. To reiterate, BOLD's mission is to educate artists and designers with the business and entrepreneurship skills needed to launch new ventures and organizations. To enable artists and designers to articulate and convey their unique value to businesses and clients. And more than anything else, BOLD is here to help you start something new, to share the strategies, tools, and network needed to create and grow that which does not yet exist. So with that, I'd like to introduce Matthew Manos. He's a great friend and an incredible leader in the world of creative entrepreneurship. Matthew is currently the founder and managing director of verynice, more on that soon, as well as the founder and editor-in-chief of Reginald, a subsidiary publication of verynice, which he'll also share about. He currently serves as the Assistant Dean for Academic Strategy at the Iovine Young Academy at USC. He's a former faculty member at Art Center in Graphic Design and Design Matters, and a graduate of the Media Design Practices program. Today, we have a chance to learn from Matthew's experience of launching his studio, verynice, in 2008, during a period of huge economic upheaval, with many similarities to what we're experiencing today. So with that, Matthew, thank you so much for joining us. We're glad to have you here and to continue this conversation about BOLD.
All right, thanks, Robbie, and thank you everybody for coming. I kind of browsed through the participant list and I see a lot of former students, current students. I see my mom and dad. Hello. Thank you so much for taking the time. And, you know, Robbie, thank you for just acknowledging the current moment in history that we're in. But before I start, I wanted to do something similar. You know, I was approached to do this, and Robbie and I talked about doing this mainly because of the kind of incredible uncertainty that we've seen from COVID-19 and the related economic fallout. But of course, I think something that we're seeing really strongly right now is that we've had another pandemic in this country for a very long time. And that's one of racism, one of police brutality, and neither of those are even remotely acceptable. And, you know, this is a Zoom room that I hope is full of good people. I'm sure is full of good people putting in the work to learn and unlearn a lot of things right now. So in some ways I might be preaching to the choir, you know, about this, but it just feels absolutely impossible to give a talk today and not acknowledge that. So again, you know, as Robbie said, we want to move forward. We want to do, you know, what we were planning to do, but it felt very important to be able to at least acknowledge that. And I do hope that we're all doing the work to try to redesign this system to something, you know, more powerful for us all that can work for everybody. So with that, this is a talk called Launching at a Time of Uncertainty, the True Story of verynice. And my face doesn't look like that. Like you can see, I was trying to go for a split screen of happy and sad, which I think is, you know, something that being an entrepreneur in a time that is uncertain, you know, brings with it as well. And my story begins with this number, $8 billion. This is not my bank account. This is not my seed funding, nothing anywhere close to that. This is the amount of money that every year in the United States alone, nonprofit organizations spend on people like me and therefore people like you every year. And I don't know about you, but hearing that this is the amount of money spent every year on design and marketing services shocked me when I first found that out. I couldn't help but think, what would a model possibly look like in which these organizations could have access to the same great services and resources that they of course need, but perhaps for a fraction of the cost or for no cost at all, right? Could we, if we could figure out a model like this, find a way to solve some of the most persistent problems out there, such as hunger, housing, water access, and more, not by doing any extra work at all, but simply by taking resources that already exist and reallocating them? Because when you really think about it, 8 billion is a lot of spare dollars every year, right? And this is just in the US. Imagine the multiples that would be at a global scale. This is where pro bono comes in. Pro bono is short for pro bono publico, which literally means for the good of the public. Pro bono service, many of you are likely familiar with this. It got its start in the late 1800s in the legal industry. And many of you who have heard of it but are a little less familiar may sort of attribute it to the work of the legal industry, of lawyers, etc. And the kind of interesting fact is that it was a concept that was grown in the late 1800s by a man named Reginald Heber Smith, who was a lawyer in New York. And he noticed around that time that a lot of immigrants were coming to the United States and felt that it was unjust that they were unable to be kind of given the same access to legal services that he felt everyone sort of deserved as a fundamental human right. So he wrote a book called Justice in the Poor, and this was a book that was advocating for his colleagues in the industry to actually perform their services for free or at a discount for people who couldn't afford it. The pro bono sort of model and industry then moved into the marketing and advertising space in the 50s and 60s, when you see things like the Ad Council come to be. Some very famous public service announcements, such as Smokey the Bear, were invented around that time by ad agencies who offered their time pro bono to make those things. And for me, some of you on the webinar might have heard that I'm a skateboarder at heart. I got my start doing pro bono work in 2005 in Sunnyvale, California. I grew up in the Bay Area, and around that time I was skateboarding competitively. And as a result, I was going to the skate park frequently. And any of you that have been to a skate park, you know that you always see something cool, something interesting when you go. But there was a moment that really stuck out to me. And this was when I met a man in a wheelchair who was ripping around the park far better than I or anybody else. He did a backflip right where you're seeing me do this layback hand plant as well. And it blew my mind. This was before YouTube, so it was before you could see cool things whenever you wanted. Needless to say, I approached him, introduced myself, and I learned that he was the founder of a nonprofit that actually taught kids in wheelchairs how to participate in extreme sports and do tricks like that as well. So I offered to design some stickers for him, and that became my first pro bono project. A few years after that, I launched verynice, which is now a design strategy practice that gives half of its work away for free to nonprofit organizations, still inspired by that encounter at the skate park as well. We've worked on all kinds of fun projects. I'll just kind of browse through a few of them. This one, actually in collaboration with another Art Center alumni, Aldous Ozelins, with Google for an organization called Peace Jam. And they were creating an app called Billion X. And we helped with the product development of that as well as the brand development of that, and became a really impactful project. The organization was nominated several times for a Nobel Peace Prize, and just is one of those projects I really look back at that I'll remember forever, being a really exciting initiative to be a part of. We focus a lot on workshops nowadays, and this was a workshop that we designed with several local organizations in the South LA area. There's a particular strip of space in that part of our city that has quite a lot of vacant lots, and the community wanted to essentially come together in a creative way to imagine what they wish to see in those lots, and then actually build out prototypes and pilots of those things as well. So we facilitated a workshop with a bunch of locals that essentially brought different residents, different community leaders together to prototype the future that they would want to see in these spaces as well. And then another example, you know, it's kind of a focus on education. We built out a innovation academy for the city of West Hollywood. And this is essentially was a kind of educational experience that government staff and the employees in the city of West Hollywood could go through to be able to build capacity around design and innovation methodologies as well. So it's just sort of a short smattering to give you a sense of what we do. The way that our work is essentially split up is in two different models. One of these, which we're most well known for, is our give half model, where we give half of our services away for free. And the way that works is nonprofits apply to work with us. We then develop teams of volunteers and of our own core staff to execute those projects in a pro bono capacity as well. And then on the other side, we have this open access model where whenever we develop a new methodology or a new framework, we actually make that published and open to the public as well to be able to utilize. And so collectively, you know, these two models have allowed us to create a pretty large impact of over $30 million of products and services being offset. We've worked with hundreds of organizations in a pro bono capacity, but our tools are now used by quite a lot of people all around the world, which has been really amazing to see. And, you know, and these are kind of numbers I'm proud of. It's a pathway I'm proud of, et cetera. But something kind of interesting that happened, you know, I've been at this for 12 years now. When we hit our 10-year anniversary, I couldn't help but think of this sort of famous quote, right? Give a person a fish and you feed them for a day, teach a person to fish and you feed them for a lifetime. And I was kind of reminded of this saying and was thinking back at everything that verynice had done and our approach to pro bono and just what pro bono is all about. And I realized that we essentially became really good at giving away fish. And, you know, it's good to give away fish. It's good to do pro bono. We still do it today. We still believe in it. But if we could actually create space or the ability for pro bono to never be required again because of actually being able to either publish trade secrets or host workshops and educational experiences to spread these methods, wouldn't that be even more impactful? And that was really the basis of, on our 10th anniversary, launching a project called Give All, where we essentially open sourced every trade secret we had developed in our first 10 years. And we published them in the form of sort of replicable step-by-step toolkits, a series of 9 of those that are available in 6 languages as well. This was a really exciting project. It was one just for me as a designer that I was very excited about. I found it kind of solidified the fact that I love writing toolkits. It's a very kind of niche, possibly nerdy interest, but it's one that I was personally very excited about and wanted to further pursue. And after seeing a positive response to this, decided to launch a new brand called Reginald, which essentially focuses on publishing toolkits like these. Not just ones created by verynice, but also ones that are created in collaboration with many different partners. And we officially launched this in January. You can kind of see we have a nice like smattering of different ones that are now available that we're creating in partnership with really cool organizations like rescue.org and their Airbell Impact Lab, the American Heart Association, a great sort of high school age incubator called Quarter Zero, an innovation consultancy in Bogota, Colombia called Pillow, and so on. So this is kind of an exciting new direction that we're going in. And so far it's led to quite a lot of impact. If you think about the amount of time that by sort of open sourcing some of these trade secrets, we're displacing in hours that would have gone into consulting or training, based on the volume of downloads we've gotten so far, it's already displaced over 100,000 hours of consulting. And that's kind of really been the big theme throughout Very Nice, is trying to offset costs or experiences that would have otherwise had to take place at a charge or at a fee for somebody as well. And so at that point, I want to kind of do a little record scratch, freeze frame. How did I get here, right? And you can see this image features all too closely my new COVID era mustache. But you know, this is a talk about the fact that this business was started in the middle of a crisis, right, in 2008. And I think what you just heard is typically the fairy tale type of story that I tell when I go around the world sharing Very Nice's story and artwork. The fact is, right, none of this was that simple, you know, and it wasn't all the kind of pretty social media version that you tend to see me share as well. And so I wanted to kind of share a little bit of what I learned, you know, starting Very Nice at this time. And then after I get through these slides, I know Robbie will come back on and we'll do some Q&A. I know some of you already sent in some great questions. Some of those I tried to address here, but we'll be able to get to more of them as well. So, you know, it was September 2008. It was the Great Recession. People were losing their jobs. Markets were crashing. There was a lot of uncertainty. Home values were plummeting. People were scared. As a soon-to-be college graduate, so was I. And maybe many of you that are kind of in a similar position right now are feeling that way. But there was three other things that were quite significant about September 2008. Revealing my age for you all. It was the month that I would turn 20 years old. It was, as everyone reminded me, the worst time to start a business. And it happened to be 5 months after I had made the decision to start Very Nice as well. And so I hope to address a few things in this talk. One is, what do you do when the world around you begins to collapse at the time you planned to launch? How can you respond to disruptive changes and reframe them as opportunities? And how can you protect the core values of your original plans and adapt to new operating models? So I'll touch a little bit on each of these. And, you know, one of the big messages that I hope to provide here is that we aren't still here despite having been founded in 2008, but instead I really see it as we're here because of having been founded in 2008. And there's four things that sort of lead me to make that statement. One is talking about success. When there's a time of sort of uncertainty, especially economic uncertainty, the traditional definitions are typically taken off the table, right? It's not about money, fancy things, or having your name on a big building. Instead, success is for you to define yourself. And this is something, you know, I'm often asked by students, what's something you know now that you wish you knew when you were first starting? And it tends to be this, that just like the kind of creativity that can go into the concept for your business and how you get to sort of own what that looks like for you, you should also feel like owning what success looks like for you, right? Maybe it is these things that we see in movies and that we hear about, et cetera. Maybe it's not, and that's completely fine. The second thing is around focus. With less demand on you to grow and scale, you can actually focus on things that are often left by the wayside, things like your mission, your vision, and your values. And, you know, when I think about Very Nice and what really put us on the map, it was the fact that we were one of the first social enterprises in the design industry. And introducing these ideas to an industry that is not familiar was an incredible challenge. It meant that we were constantly needing to educate people about what we do and why. And this ended up leading to a lot more clarity around our value and our purpose. And we would not have been able to do this if we were so obsessed with the traditional viewpoints of success and with sort of focusing on scale above anything else at that time. That was just impossible to do. Another thing, you know, that I've learned is change. Uncertainty and change can come as a set, right? Whereas a comfortable known reality may feel crowded for new ideas to find a way in. An unknown reality brings with it opportunity to reframe and uncover new opportunities. And that's something that I think is really exciting as well. And along those notes of change, this is, one thing that I always try to hold close and think about in a way that can be, I hope, as not come across as overly paranoid, but every single of change, imagine it is going to be certain and permanent, right? When COVID hit, verynice had recently shifted to really specialize in workshop facilitation. That is something that requires people to be in crowded rooms in close proximity sharing materials. It's something that can't really be done very easily, right, with physical distancing. But what we did instead is we assumed that we're just never going to be able to be in a room with people ever again, right? And of course, that's like a ridiculous assumption, but we assumed that. And that gave us the kind of energy and motivation to become really good at doing workshops over Zoom, and just getting excited about that and seeing that as an opportunity to learn and to play. During the recession, we also saw a big spike in the growth of the freelance economy that eventually led to products like Uber and Airbnb. And verynice's operational model is very inspired by this as well, and a product of this, as since day one, we've maintained a small team that's been supplemented by a large network of freelancers and volunteers. So I think learning from those patterns at that time and trying to adopt those definitely made us, who we are today as well. And I think, the fourth thing, which is really important to remember in and out of a crisis, although I don't think we're ever out of a crisis, it seems, we're all connected, right? During the 2008 era, and still to this day, we saw a lot of social enterprises like verynice come out regularly, either during the recession or right after it. And this is because we all, I hope, become much more aware during a crisis how connected we are to each other. We're already seeing this now, right, with different companies that are making their own creative responses to the pandemic. But something that I think is really important is to never capitalize on a pandemic or on a crisis, right? Don't sell life insurance, in quotes, because if you want to get into the insurance field, that's totally fine. A crisis is not a time to capitalize on fear, right? It's a time to come together as human beings and hopefully be of service to one another. And so, with that, I hope my story and the stories of so many others that you'll certainly hear at Bold assure you that while nothing's easy, it's possible to put things out into the world in a time of uncertainty. And those of you that are about to graduate, I hope that gives you some reassurance. I'm not going to sugarcoat it, right? None of this is ever easy. But I think it is important to remember that things are possible. And of course, this is a time to really take care of yourself and to lift each other up. A lot of people are going through a lot right now. And so this is something really important to remember, of course, from a safe distance. So with that, I want to say thank you. And then Robbie, we can get to the Q&A together.
Brilliant. Thank you, Matt. That's great.
Of
so
course.
To kick things off with the questions, firstly, for all of our attendees, please use the Q&A to submit any questions that you have. And we're available and open to anything you might be wondering about in a big way, in a small way, practical details, strategic vision, all of that, how that comes together. So Matthew, my question for you will be, to begin with, can you share with us some examples of how you've had to frame and reframe your mission on a client by client or a kind of collaboration by collaboration basis? So knowing that you started off with this vision and knowing that your work has evolved so much, what are some of those ways that you've framed and reframed, and how has that played out with like a single partner?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, and that's one of the things I didn't even really touch on in the talk is what Very Nice does today is so different than when it first launched as well, right? So I guess first, to just kind of quickly cover that, we launched originally as a graphic design practice. So focusing on, branding, on marketing collateral. And then, eventually kind of added web design when that was becoming like a everybody has to offer that kind of thing, in 2009-ish. And then, design thinking became this really big thing that's in all of the magazines and all of the newspapers. And as right around the time I was doing my MFA at Art Center, I kind of made this conscious decision of, this whole strategy thing is really fascinating, right? And started to work towards that. And now that is all that we do, right? So there's kind of this evolution from visual design to design strategy that took place, over those 12 years, essentially. And because of that, to kind of answer your question of how you maybe change or reframe your mission, the really interesting thing is the one thing that has never changed since, honestly, that encounter at the skate park that I talked about is the why, right? Is why are we doing this? That's been the only thing about this company that looks remotely the same throughout every single change that we've had, through having 3 offices across the country to being totally remote, right? Like, the thing that's never changed is our mission is to alleviate expenses for nonprofits, right? And that has always been kind of the center pole. And I feel like it's important to say that because, from my perspective, and I know there's a lot of people that write about this and talk about this, if you can, be fortunate enough to find that why behind what you do, I actually think it's okay to not be so married to the what. And this was something that I even thought about in college when I was starting up. Is I probably would have started Very Nice even if I went to law school. It just maybe would have been a law firm that gave half of its services away for free, right? Like, I don't think that what we do has ever mattered that much. And that's why, if any of you have seen me give a talk before, I rarely show our work. I showed you a few projects today, but it's kind of rare for me to do that. I don't focus so much on that. What has changed, though, is, maybe you would say like the mission of our focus, right? Of that what. And I found that has been a challenge. The biggest challenge being moving from visual graphic design to design strategy. That was a process that took, is probably going to scare people on the webinar, I think 5 years, to be honest, to make that full transition. So it was a long transition. And what it took was getting the right projects that could prove to people what we were capable of doing. And that's not easy, and you can't fake it till you make it, right? Like, these strategy projects are really serious and have big implications. So we had to be really humble. And, one of the nice things about doing pro bono work is we were able to reach out to some nonprofits that we really trusted. And this was around 2011 or 12, and say like, hey, we're kind of interested in learning more about strategy and how to be, useful. Do you mind if we do like a speculative project together just to try it? We promise we won't take up much of your time in case it's a total flop, but if it's helpful, you can use the results, right? And so we did that for a few organizations who we had built a relationship with, and it taught us a lot. I always believe in learning by doing things, right? And so that was really helpful. And then eventually, it was in 2015, we won, our first massive strategy project where we beat out, some of the biggest consultancies in the world for it. And we were just this, tiny little shop. And that was the moment that I felt like, okay, I can call myself a strategist, so it was a long transition period, and something that I'm glad that I didn't rush, to be honest. I think, in entrepreneurship and sort of startup life, the speed tends to be a common theme, and that's something I've always tried to avoid, actually. everything that I've done has been pretty slow, actually. Yeah.
So that's great. And within that, what have some of the actual negotiations been like when you've been bringing in these new capabilities into your pitch, so to speak, knowing you have a great network of existing partners, but how have they responded? How has that evolution kind of played out on a, in the room, in the meeting before the negotiations have been complete?
Yeah. So I think like a great example would be from the pitch that I was mentioning in 2015, where we won, the biggest project that we ever had at that point. And, we were in the room with a massive nonprofit organization. Every single member of their C-suite was in there. And we were asked to, pitch what we would do to essentially like create kind of a 15-year future vision for their billion-dollar organization, right? So this was one where I went in with my partner at the time, and it was like a week before Christmas too, and honestly we both kind of went into it thinking like, well, this will be good practice, right? Like we'll just do our best, we'll be honest, we'll tell them how we would approach this. Tell them we've never done anything at this scale before, and just see what happens, right? Like that was, I think, the best thing, talking about like before getting into the room, is just going in saying, yeah, we're not going to win this thing, so we might as well just not sugarcoat any of it, And what we found, and what I actually talked to them years later about that, like, hey, how do you think that went? Because obviously we won, we won that project, but what were you thinking when we were presenting? And they cited, and this was, 4 years later, they cited that they thought we had the most honest presentation out of anyone they had seen. And so that sense of honesty, which, I don't think anyone ever wants to advocate that somebody not be honest, right? But let's face it, like entrepreneurship and pitching, you tend to stretch the truth a little bit. That's something you see a lot with new businesses that are trying to get people excited about the potential of what they're doing. I think what we really learned is something that I hope is somewhat obvious, but it's just truly being yourself in that situation is really important. The other thing that they said is they felt like we really listened to them. And so, going into that pitch, really knowing what were the problems that they were facing and actually just acknowledging those problems, right? What meant a lot to them as well. And then finally, at the end of that presentation, we went through like 3 value propositions that we would bring, right? Like why us, basically. And 2 of them were kind of expected, it was about sort of the team that we were proposing to put together, which were really amazing people, relevant projects we had done that, even though not at that scale, that kind of pointed to us being a good fit. But then the 3rd value proposition, which I still kind of like laugh about today, was just a slide that says, we actually care about your project, and I think, and I remember riffing on it a bit of, we aren't some giant consultancy that's working on 1,000 of these at a time, like this is literally going to be what I focus on for the next 10 months. And it's what I'm going to be thinking about every day. And I'm going to be really excited about it, so I think, again, kind of like bringing that honesty and the human element to it was really important in that room, and kind of what happened there as well.
Excellent. So I have definitely some questions coming in here from the audience.
Cool.
And I will start with the top. So this is maybe more of a tactical question about the way verynice operates. Mm-hmm. So it is, how do you provide a free service and make a return mm-hmm. and a profit on your work at the same time? How do you do that simultaneously?
Yeah, it's a great question. And as you can imagine, I get that question a lot, right? And that was sort of, it was one of those things where I came up with that idea before I knew exactly how that would be possible. And then I had to kind of figure it out. I think first, a good thing to say is like, why do we give half, right? Because it's actually kind of subjective, right? Like we're not saying, hey, every company should give half of their work away. We're advocating that people integrate pro bono in some way into their work, right? We give half because we feel as though anything that you spend more than half of your time doing is now all of a sudden not an extracurricular activity, right? It's integral to what we do. And so the fact that we give half of our services away is purely symbolic, actually, that kind of decision. How we actually manage to do it, I actually wrote a whole book about this called How to Give Half of Your Work Away for Free. So you can learn every detail about our model by looking at that. It's at givehalf.co. Obviously, it's a free book, right? Kind of dug myself into a hole with that one. But the basic gist of it is a method that I called the double half methodology, which is essentially the concept that if you want to give half of your work away and do just as well as another firm that does similar things to you at a similar scale, you actually have to do double the work that they do, right? And that was kind of my very first, way back in college, nugget of a thought of how to make this work. And of course, you hear me say that and you're like, well, wait a minute. How on earth are you going to work double, right? Like you don't want to work 80 hours a week, although I've definitely done that before. How do you make that sustainable? And that was where the idea for us to actually utilize volunteers came in. So we have a network of, I think we can now say over 800 volunteers. I think we hit 800 like 2 weeks ago or something. And these are professional designers. They're actually a lot of student designers on there too, strategists, writers, artists, etc., who all came to us and said, hey, love the mission. I'd love to help out with a pro bono project if you need the help. And so what we do is when we take on a pro bono project, me or someone like me is kind of serving as the creative director or project manager. And then we are actually working with volunteers to help us execute that project. And in doing so, the pro bono work is not accomplished entirely for free. Like we have some overhead with it, but it is accomplished at a rate of, or kind of at a cost to us that is way less than if we were having full-time salaried people working on these things. So that was kind of the creative solution to be able to afford that. And I think is the part of the model that has like surprised people the most, because, most people say like, how would you ever convince people to want to work for free on things? And we never solicit it. Like we always just, I do talks like this and no pressure, but I guarantee 2 of these 55 people are going to email me after and ask how they can volunteer. I mean, it happens every time, right? So there's people out there that want to do this, and we just keep our door open to those people. We're not a crowdsourcing company, so it's not like we're working on 800 projects at a time. We model it sort of after how an ad agency might with freelancers, where just per project kind of call upon people who they feel like might be a good fit and go from there with it as well. But yeah, that's basically how we do it.
And to follow on that, what have been some of the things you've noticed in that volunteer network? Sort of where have they taken the work and the opportunity and the engagement that they've had with you and the team and the other collaborators, and how have they taken that forward and either with you or in parallel or in another way?
Yeah, well, so I think one of the really interesting things is the demographics of our network are like all over the board. We've got just to talk about age alone, we've had volunteers that were in high school and they worked on a project with us to confirm that is what they want their college major to be, And so for someone like that, obviously with very little experience, we're doing a lot more hand holding, and it's more of a mentorship kind of situation. But I love that story, you know, of helping them. I mean, how great would that be if you could actually try out the thing that comes after college before you choose your major? You know, I thought that was so smart of them to think of that, you know, professionally in that way. We have a lot of people that are early career. That's probably our biggest, you know, our biggest population of people in the network who got their first job and are kind of like, you know, I'm lacking that sense of purpose behind what I do, you know. Not to say working for a big corporation is bad or something, but a lot of them do that, and then they kind of have that feeling, and they want to be able to think that they're using their skills to contribute to some kind of impact, you know, for something. And then we do have students. That's definitely a population, and then we have people that are later career or even retired, who at that point are very selective with the projects they take on, and you know, are less concerned about the financial aspect of the projects as well. So yeah, it's a really nice mix. And you know, I think there's definitely stories like helping someone choose their college major. It's funny how often we get asked, "Oh, am I going to be allowed to put this in my portfolio?" You know, and my answer is always, "Well, duh." You know, I mean, what a horrible state our industry is in, where we're not allowed to show the work we do, like, let alone for a pro bono project. Are you kidding me? You know, so that's something I think nonprofits have just been, or I mean, sorry, designers have just been so damaged by NDAs. It's like, get out of here, you know? So we do want to help people grow their portfolio and their experience through this as well. I mean, that's definitely a big, I think a big return from doing pro bono work, added flexibility and things like that.
Great, great. And there's a couple of other questions here, but just an additional follow-up to that. So much of the message for artists and designers and students and you know, at Art Center, at USC, across the whole community of art and design colleges, is to be very careful about undervaluing your work, right? And there's a whole community of relatively nefarious, sort of business-minded people that are trying to get a really good deal on design services. It could be photography, it could be graphic design, it could be website or layout, strategy, any of those things. How do you kind of balance that dynamic, knowing that you're also a teacher and somebody that's advocating for the career results of our community?
Yeah, that's a great question. And when I first started verynice, this was a time, so I mean, as you can imagine, during the recession, right, what professional designer wanted to hear that they should be giving their work away for free, right? People did not like this idea at all. It was bizarre timing on my part. And so when I launched it and when I started going out there and advocating, you know, I think it was a time in my life where I was just much more, I don't know if it's like ambitious, but at least like, you know, much more confident than I am now. I kind of look back at that. I was like, God, what, you know, I was so up in arms about this. Like, I really was fighting for the fact that everyone should give their work away for free. Like, that was a huge push that I had. And I got a lot of negative response. And I think a big part of it was around that time, you know, organizations like AIGA were doing a lot of big pushes against spec work, which if you're not familiar with that and you're listening, it's short for speculative work. And it's basically when a client forces a designer to essentially like, oh, just do a quick mock-up for us, right? Before even getting the contract, they force you to kind of do work ahead of it. And the industry is still very against that, but that was particularly a hot topic around that time. And what I found, and kind of what finally helped me with my messaging around this, is people were confusing pro bono work with spec work, you know, or this whole advocacy I was doing around giving work away for free. They thought that I was also advocating for spec work. And realizing that and kind of becoming aware of that, really sort of changed the way that I talked about it, where I started to kind of advocate, and this starts to answer your question. Basically there's a time and place for doing work for free. And what I've done with verynice, and what we try to help others do who are interested in doing pro bono, is institutionalize pro bono, which means set guardrails around it, right? We have pro bono agreements with nonprofits. If you are not a 501c3, I'm not doing pro bono work for you, right? And things like that. So having these kind of hard rules where you never feel like you have to do this work unless you are actually you are going to benefit from it, and the organization you're working with is going to benefit from it, right? And the kind of simplest way that I've always put this is, if somebody at some chain in an organization is going to get a bigger Christmas bonus because of what you did, you deserve a cut of that, right? But at a nonprofit, that's not happening. Any leftover income due to a successful campaign is being directly invested into a program that they're launching, or the IRS is going to come knocking on their door, And so I think that realization of their structure in the way that they use their money made me feel very strongly about saying it actually is a good thing for a designer to do, and I also want to say, kind of related to some things we were talking about earlier, pro bono work is quite a privilege to be able to do as well, right? And that's something to be really conscious of as well. I don't want people to feel like everyone has to do pro bono or they're a bad person, which honestly 2008 Matthew would have said. but I don't believe that anymore. I think, again, there's a time and a place for things to be free. You do have to make sure that you're taking care of yourself as well, and then hopefully making this work for you in some way if it's something that you're interested in.
Completely. And I think that you're touching on a sort of foundational point about entrepreneurship, which is that the way to create something that does not exist requires committing time and energy and effort without always having a clear path, or without always somebody knowing exactly how to compensate you for that. And I think that what you're laying out for us is a very clear way to look at the mission rather than the kind of financial outcome or the sort of career success, in order to really rethink what that original commitment of time and energy and effort might be. And to put that at the forefront of your commitment to a startup or a new organization or whatever other, entrepreneurial effort you might be undertaking. Yeah. And that's so important, because often you do have to speculate a little bit in the world of starting new things. Not everybody's going to understand, and there's not always going to be a budget for it. And even, both out on your own as a small organization and within larger groups and larger companies and larger working environments. So making sure you're going back to the mission. And yeah. I think that's something that our community is good at, but just to always reiterate. So that's great. And I realize we could probably go even deeper into this sort of subject about time and value. But let's jump into another question from the audience. So, a good chunk, this is to quote the question, a good chunk of my energy, and for those around me, virtually, goes to dealing with our current situation and situations. Any thoughts on how to regain full focus and get back to productivity in a way that you might have done beforehand?
Yeah, gosh, I've been struggling with this myself as well. And I'm in such a position of privilege, and I acknowledge that. And I'm still, struggling with this and taking the time to do a lot of reading. And, I live in downtown. I look out my window and there's military helicopters, right? It's not a good feeling right now. And so I feel like in general, it's okay to not be productive right now, first of all. I think that we often favor productivity over our own well-being. It's so ironic for me to be saying this because I've done that countless times, right? But I think that it's important to acknowledge that, before I kind of just jump to quickly giving you some productivity tips and tricks, right? Like it's okay to not be productive sometimes, and to kind of soak in what's happening. That's a very important thing to do. Something that's helped me before with trying to regain focus is kind of making my time more precious. And so what I mean by that, and actually my wife Katie inspired this whole kind of way that I think, where she was at a time, and she's across the table smiling at me now. She was at a time in her career where she wanted to focus on creating more art and photography. And so, luckily we were in a position where she could kind of pursue that full time for a little bit there. So she was working on that for a couple of weeks, and then realized that she wasn't being as productive as she wanted to be. And we talked about it, and we realized it was because she had all the time in the world for it, and therefore time didn't feel precious. So she ended up getting a part-time job. And what that did is it constrained her working hours for her art significantly. But because it was part-time, there still were hours that she could put towards it. And she ended up producing more work than ever before. So I kind of use that as an example, because if you are struggling to be productive, what you can do, and this is something I do regularly, is on your calendar, like let's say you use Google Calendar or something, you can actually block off time for you to be productive, right? And you can say, okay, in this hour, this is called time boxing, in this hour, I'm going to work on this project, and this is what I'm going to finish. And I typically do this before every week starts. I block off my whole calendar with projects that I need to work on. And what I love about it is any instance where I'm not working on something, my own stress around my productivity went way down, because I know that I already, I'm going to get to that. I know that I have that scheduled to do that. So that's one thing that I think is really helpful. The other, which I think can really help with productivity and well-being, is taking time for some mindfulness practices, right? Like something that I do a lot is draw or paint or write poetry, and actually scheduling time for you to do that, even though that might not be in any way related to what you're supposed to be doing. I think it can give you a new kind of energy, a new kind of balance to then bring to your work, right? So making sure that you are making time for things like that, I think would be another bit of advice that I would give.
Great. Time boxing is such an effective way to handle that, especially when you've got 10, 20 projects going on with different timelines. It's so hard to manage without those kinds of tools.
For sure.
So another question at a broad level, can you, Matthew, define the definition of design strategy for the current socioeconomic climate?
Cool. Okay. Yeah.
It's sort of a challenging one, but I like it.
Yeah, I love it. Well, so the way that so first, the way that I define design, right? Because there's two words in there. There's design and there's strategy. And this relates heavily to the current climate. I see design as the ability to build a bridge between the needs of people and the needs of business, right? People are central to design. You all hear about human-centered design, et cetera. But so is, like, whether we like it or not, industry and commerce. It's so tied to our design world and kind of what we work within. So that's how I define design. And then the way that I define strategy is deciding what not to do, right? So it's after you've done your research, you've collected all of the possible avenues that your business or your movement or your project or whatever it is can take. it's ultimately deciding what not to do, which therefore is telling you what you are going to do, right? So when I think about design strategy, I think of going through a process where you take the time to really understand the needs of people that are centered around this particular product, this particular system, whatever it is. And then you really take the time to understand the goals of the business as well. So it's sort of marrying a very top-down perspective with a very bottom-up perspective as well. And then making decisions with both of those parties together of what would be the best intervention here, what would be the best object to create, et cetera. And I think why this really relates to our current system is you can see even my use of the word top down, and any of you that have kind of heard of this type of lingo, right? This isn't my lingo, this is industry speak. Top down, we immediately think that means a corporate authority figure, their perspective, right, being then shared with the bottom, which is the people, right? And how twisted is that is our language. So the way that we should think about design strategy in this current climate is this level playing field of the end benefactors, the end users, the end customers, having a seat at the table with the people that are, let's call them the sponsors, right? The ones that are maybe ultimately funding the development of something. And as a designer, facilitating that process and helping everybody remember, the goals at hand, or the mechanics of if something's actually going to be feasible, or the aesthetics, is something going to be actually desirable, along the way as well. So yeah, so hopefully that answer kind of helps a bit, but it's a complicated industry for sure, because of how much it relies on these very now hopefully more out of date perspectives on things.
Right, and I think it's so much a moment to really use different words, or reframe what those words mean, or even confront the kind of assumption about what those structures are. And the way that before the webinar, we were talking about a lot of the language that we have isn't quite adequate anymore to deal with what we're confronting, both with the pandemic and with all of the injustice that is raising to the surface. And that's a design challenge.
Mm-hmm.
In a lot of ways, that's how do we come up with new ways of speaking and framing and sharing and communicating, and that's, I think, what we're as a community uniquely capable of. So in many ways, you're already doing this through your work, and sharing that through our broad community as part of the goal, I think, is a huge step forward. So to go back to the questions again, and this is again tactical, for pro bono projects or projects that you give discounts to, how do you determine if this will be beneficial for everyone, especially if you're still in need of more funding to keep your operations going?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in terms of if it's beneficial to the nonprofit, I think starting there, we never, maybe I shouldn't say never, I'm sure this has probably happened before, but very rarely do we actually kind of cold call a nonprofit and say, hey, can we do pro bono work for you? They're always the ones that initiate it. And that, I think, is a good hard rule to make sure that you are not imposing your own interests on somebody. I mentioned earlier that we had some partners that allowed us to kind of try out strategy services, but those had been partners that we had worked with for a few years already at that point. So I think, that as like a base bar, right? Are we going to be helpful to the nonprofit? Maybe we kind of think so, just in the fact that they had approached us, right? And had kind of told us what problem they were facing and why they think we would be even useful, in that situation. that isn't a guarantee, though, that our work is ultimately going to be beneficial for them, right? So that's why we vet that, we have a conversation with them, we set the expectations in a very honest way, and we do ask them, or we do try to uncover like what sort of resources that we can't offer would this project need either during it or after it, to ensure that we're not creating, we're not like installing air conditioners in a building that doesn't have outlets, right? Like that kind of thing. And so that's on that part. In terms of for us, by having the ability to receive those applications and kind of look into, what the needs are, we can sort of quickly assess if it's a cause that we're particularly, passionate about serving. I don't think necessarily every cause we've worked on is something that we're super passionate about. Like there's of course some that we've been more than others, but regardless, we do try to ask the question, will we maybe learn something from this? Will this be an interesting and exciting challenge for us? Will our being involved actually move the needle on an issue that they're trying to solve, and that's something that we also try to think about too. So I guess, to kind of answer the question, it's sort of running through all of that and then seeing, is this beneficial, first of all, to the nonprofit? We always start there. And then, is it something that we will, be satisfied with on our end too? Because I think, as selfish as that might sound, if you're not personally excited about a project you're working on, it's going to show in the work, and that alone will harm the nonprofit actually, right? If you don't really want to be doing it. So that is an important thing to consider for any of you that are doing pro bono work, right? Is the kind of give and take of that as well.
Well, that's actually a perfect transition to this question here, which is, free services don't always get the same respect and seriousness as paid services. How do you manage the pro bono projects to ensure that you're not wasting your team's time and enthusiasm?
Mm-hmm.
I think that aligns.
Yeah. So the kind of funny thing that I feel like we don't have any full-time designers on our team right now. But if you had asked our past designers in particular, and I say the designers as opposed to kind of the more of like managers and strategists that we have now, who tend to be more involved in the business side, which is not always the case, but typically if any of you work in like an agency, you're normally assigned to a project and you're working on a project. We had our former design director, Elisa, who started out as my intern, and I worked with her for like 6 years, and as time went on, she became more and more involved in the business side. And the funny thing is, she told me, some days she had no clue if she was working on a pro bono project or a paid project. Like in her earlier years, she just assumed it was just a project to work on. And I loved that she said that, because I thought it was really validating to a perspective that I hope to, actually have and act upon at verynice, which is that the project should be treated the same, regardless of if they're getting paid or not. They're both equally important, problems that we're trying to solve, or designs that we're trying to make, right? So I think to an extent, with a team, I don't know if you necessarily as a leader have to say, hey, this is a pro bono one, so like don't really worry about it. I don't think that is a great way to go about it. And then on the business side, something that we did years ago that ended up being transformative is having pro bono agreements with these nonprofits. So, we had the very typical thing that you might expect, which is, a project kind of dragging on, or a pro bono client not, taking the work as seriously, or, we had all that happen. And we found that when we created a pro bono agreement that would clearly list the scope of work, of what is it that we are actually responsible for, and then even more importantly, state the market value of the service, right? And then say that it's 100% discounted. That was a huge help, because now everyone involved knew exactly what this was valued at in the way that our world is most comfortable, which is money, which is dollars. What would this have cost me? We make that very clear and transparent to everyone that we work with as well. And I think that that's helped.
I think that's something that individuals can do on their own as well. When you have a potential client that doesn't have the budget that you're hoping for or that you really require, make sure to put that dollar amount that is the full cost, that would be what you would charge in a perfect situation, and then discount it in the invoice. Do not give them the price as the discounted price. And that's a great way to just have a record and an indicator of what it is that your value actually is. And if somebody then wants to do a project again, you can say, hey, this is the rate, and
absolutely,
we negotiated after that, but this is where the conversation starts. And that's especially for people getting out into their first gigs or their first contracts. This is something that you can use.
Absolutely. And one thing just to add to that, let's say, because I know it's a lot of designers in the audience, let's say you're working on a logo design project, right? And you tell the client it's going to be $5,000, right? Let's throw a big number out there. And they're like, oh, no way, it's going to be 1,000, right? And you can say, okay, that's fine, but you get only one revision. You don't get brand guidelines, and you don't get social media assets, which all of the 5K would have included, right? You're actually taking things away, and it's not just arbitrarily this number changes, because that completely makes your value completely subjective, right? You want to actually line item these things when you can. And I think that'll really help you with negotiations.
Completely agree. And it's good that we're recording this, because that's a message that a lot of students encounter.
For sure.
So another kind of big picture question here, which is, can you help define the difference between design consultant and design strategist?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's funny, actually, at the academy, at the school I teach at, we had a class called design consulting that I taught, and we changed the name to design strategy. And so this exact question came up. And it's funny, I've been trying to think of an actual really good answer to this, right? Because at first I didn't have quite a direct answer to why strategy and not consultant. And then after kind of thinking about it for a while, I'll tell you where I sort of landed on the difference. First of all, design strategy is a growing known job title, right? And position that people have, versus design consultant is not necessarily, right? That's not necessarily a practice or a discipline that is as well established as design strategist, graphic designer, web designer, right, et cetera. So that was kind of one side of it. But really, after thinking about it more, what I realized is that consulting, that word is much more of a definition of a type of relationship, right, that somebody has. I am a consultant to this company, which means I am this outside expert or set of hands that comes in and advises them on different ways forward with things, versus a strategist is more of a position or a discipline that they're using that has methods associated with it, et cetera. And so it's a small nuance. Hopefully, that explanation was clear enough where you could kind of pick up on it. But basically, one is more of a mode of interacting with people, or a way of defining a relationship that you might have. And the other is more of an actual discipline or an actual, trade that you're offering in general. So that's kind of how I would differentiate it. They get used together all the time though. So it's a really good question.
I feel like just in the words themselves, to consult is to do so from a point of separation
Mm-hmm.
and strategy is something that is integrated, and connected. And I
For
think
sure.
that's huge.
For sure.
So let's see what connects next here. We do have about 5 more questions to get through. So I guess these maybe could be combined into one question. So with so many issues in front of us, what are the highest impact areas to work in from your point of view? And then the next question is, what tips do you have for those that are trying to transition into this type of work? So
Cool.
if we look at those impact areas that you see in real need, and then maybe how some people could find their way into working on those types of projects or within those types of challenge areas.
Yeah, and when you say this kind of work, you mean like impact oriented work
Yeah,
or
exactly.
okay.
Your sort of
Mm-hmm.
impact and mission driven,
Mm-hmm.
human driven work.
Yeah. So first of all, on what are kind of I get asked this quite a bit, like what cause should I focus on, right? Like that kind of question, which I know that's not exactly how it was worded, right? But so essentially, like what is the most urgent issue right now? And I think as we've all seen, there are a lot of urgent issues right now, right? There's the issue of climate change. There's the issue of pandemics. There's the issue of housing. There's the issue of racism. There are so many, right? Which can be very overwhelming, right? And you're like, oh my God, am I doing enough? Or am I picking the right one? And I think part of the way that you make that decision is highly personal, and because the reality is there are infinite amazing things that you could be working on, and there kind of isn't a right answer. There's some things that get more attention on a given week, right? Or more like awareness on a given week, but these things never actually go away, right? So that's something to kind of think about is what do you personally feel maybe like a close relationship to, right? If like for me, I always kind of struggled with that. There was never a specific cause that I felt I had a huge relationship to. I was just sort of personally interested in all of them, to be honest, right? And then what I kind of landed on was the cause of pro bono work. And that was very tied to my story of becoming a designer and learning about the issues of access to design services, right? And that like it tied to my story, and so I felt like I could really do something about it. So to the extent that you can kind of look within and reflect, what is a cause that maybe you've been personally affected by, maybe that you've personally been a part of, of having that be a problem, right? And then what can you do about it personally? So trying to find a point of connection, I think, is useful. If you were to ask me like what do I think right now based on everything that's going on would be important to focus on, I think a big part of it would be our education system, right? I mean, so many of the issues that we have are tied into our perception and kind of the blind spots that have been put up upon us of how this country came to be, for example, right? And also a lack of kind of critical thinking that I think creates a lot of ignorance and a lot of issues in the world as well, and making those kinds of skills more accessible and apparent to more people, I think can ultimately lead to a big impact. The other thing that I think is important to advocate for, which could be tied to education too, is more skills around futures thinking and the ability to understand sort of the implications of our actions, which I think COVID-19 is a really great example of not having leadership that knows how to think about the future, to be completely honest, right? And thinking about implications of every single decision that is being made, ultimately creating a future. one that we might like, one that we might not like, so I think those are two really valuable things as well.
Well, right. And to add to that, something that you brought up and I'm reminded by is that the goal cannot be solely to make money.
Mm-hmm.
We are seeing the limits of that as a system, right? And that the sort of fundamentals of business need to push beyond return on investment and needs to include a much wider set of returns: return on health, return on education, return on environment, return on rights. Any way you think about that, if you can help communities and organizations, and through your design and creative work, expand their view on that, it's going to have a huge impact in all of these ways.
For sure. Yeah. No, it's something I advocate for a lot, especially I have a tool called Models of Impact that's all about designing business models that balance revenue and impact. And part of it is essentially just like a propaganda campaign that I've had for the last 5 years to try to convince people of that, of the way that we see success in business, or the way that we even set up our business model, is just inherently problematic. Some days you can point out the window and see our world is actually on fire, right? Because of climate change, because of, overproduction or depleting resources, or just so many issues that honestly just are not sustainable anymore. So, I think it's a very hard thing to unlearn. When we think about business, we immediately think about money. We think about maximizing shareholder value, right, above all else. There's literally a famous quote that says that. And it just doesn't work anymore, so I think encouraging these new ways of thinking is really important and really hard, to do.
Completely agree. So a few more questions have been coming in here, and I think maybe some from a different time zone, so I'm going to get those first. So and I'll read this one directly. How often does a pro bono client's lack of a sound general strategy impact your work as a designer in studio? How do you help them to address these fundamental, maybe deficiencies or lack of information, or just imaginative capacity?
Yeah, so one part of it is actually by offering to do the strategy work with them. And I say with them, it's like kind of a key word here, because very often when you approach or when you're approached by an organization, their senior leadership likes to think, and rightfully so, that they are the only people that are responsible for strategy of the organization, right? Because they're the leaders of the organization, they should set that, etc. And so there can be some friction when you offer to help with that as well. But I think it's important for you to do it with them, so that you can build your design solutions on a stronger base as well. When we used to purely do the production output of something, maybe it was helpful work, but we actually don't know, because we rarely knew what the long-term strategy of that organization was. We just weren't allowed to be a part of that conversation. And I found when we started asking more to be a part of that, our work did improve. So I think I do think that that's an important thing to be considering as a designer. The mindset that you bring is very strategic, actually, and very valuable to many different aspects of an organization.
Right, and not to just see it as one piece of the puzzle, not just to say we're going to deliver a website to do X, but that your ability to think around that entire context of where that website might live and how it communicates and the experience of it, that is not always intuitive for people. I think often the design and creative community looks inwardly for comparison points and sees other people doing the same thing and feels like it's the norm, but in fact it's so not the norm. And anyway, that's my 2 cents on that. The couple more questions coming in here, so I'm just going to go through them, and we only have about 8 more minutes in our allotted time here, so we'll try to get them all. One is this is being recorded. Yes, we will post this up on YouTube after today, probably tomorrow, and we can send a link over on that. And then here again, another kind of tactical question: how do you manage the cost of your business, paying for rent and staff? Mm-hmm. What are some of those strategies?
Well, so again, the pro bono work, just to be kind of clear, doesn't cost us much to do, thanks to our community of volunteers and my own personal time going into it. And I don't have a salary at Verynice. I just draw on our profits. So that's something that's very helpful. In terms of how do we kind of make ends meet, this is a similar issue that many studios and agencies have. And the funny thing is, I've been at it for 12 years now, and it actually surprisingly gets a little bit easier, but it never actually gets easy. Like, there is always going to be months where you're like, oh my God, I don't have any revenue coming in, and then there's going to be months where you're doing great, and that is kind of the nature of owning a small business, right? It's not unique to design. That's if you start a restaurant, that's if you start a chiropractor company, right? It doesn't matter. All small businesses kind of face that. But what I've found is that the more that we can focus on trying to win a few key anchor projects for that, and these are typically, 6 to 12 month long projects that have a significant amount of deliverables attached to them, and therefore are, at a decent rate, to cover overhead. I found that I used to just try to win every single project I could. But once I kind of shifted my mindset to no, actually try to win like 2 or 3 really big ones, work really hard to win those, and then kind of keep your door open to the other opportunities, but don't necessarily be banging on doors to get those, right? That became kind of a really good business strategy for keeping things afloat and for being able to, have some years that are, of course, like always better than others, but that allow you to kind of reinvest into the business and hopefully make more impact as well. So, but I guess like a technical answer to it is we get paid, fee for service from some clients. All of our products are pay what you want. So some people do donate when they download those, and those are our 2 primary revenue models that we have.
Great. So this one can be maybe the preface to then the last one. So has Verynice experienced any near-death experiences? How do you manage them? What would you do differently, knowing what you've learned from that?
Oh yeah, for sure. I think it was 2014 was one of the most stressful years of my life. That's for sure. And that was when we had 3 anchor projects that all had to cancel on us. Not for any bad reason. Like, this stuff just happens, right? But all of them canceled. And to be totally honest, like, just in the interest of trying to educate anyone that's going to go on this kind of path, what that actually looked like was putting most of my life savings into the company and not being paid for 6 months while still having a mortgage, right? And that was just completely terrifying as a process to go through. And so things that I learned from that, but then obviously then we bounced back right at the end of that year. We won that larger project that I was referencing earlier. So what I learned from that is to not try to kind of scale too fast, right? Which means try your best to actually not have a very heavy overhead. That was a time where we had employees across 3 offices, and we're at our largest in terms of footprint, and payroll. And I learned that, it's just good to be conservative around things like that, so that every month you aren't just, fighting to survive, right? The other thing that I learned is to really focus on the projects that you are very good at, and then actually refer out the rest, right? At that time, we were taking on web design and development, for example. But design was our specialty, development was not, right? And we would find ourselves having to sort of manage a process that we knew well, but not that we knew as well as others. And so ever since then, we actually only would do the design side and then recommend a different vendor for our clients to work with on the development side. And that kind of was another big like relief of stress with projects as well. So yeah, but yeah, that was probably the scariest time in our history, and I learned a lot from it as well, and save. It's good to like save money and don't spend it all. Don't spend all of your business's money. That's something I've always been good at. It's like have that buffer in there just in case.
One thing I've heard a lot of entrepreneurs say is that there's always a moment when you have to put your house up against the business's collateral. You're lucky to have a house.
Yeah, for sure.
And that's very stressful. It's your entire existence. So last, I think we can probably cover these last two. So when you do a project with volunteers, do you put them into teams, or is it individual with you as the bridge to connect? And how do you manage the quality with the sort of volunteer team process?
For sure. Yeah. So it depends on the project. For some smaller scale projects, it's just one volunteer and they have a very specific role, and we vetted them based on their portfolio or their background, and they're using methods that we've developed to be consistent with the way that verynice like works and does things, right? So that kind of answers the quality assurance side and the size of the team too. There are other instances though where we have many different volunteers on a single project because it might be a bigger one, and that's more common, I would say, than the single volunteer, mainly because we never want one volunteer to burden too much of the work, right? Because they're volunteering, and they've got other jobs or other things going on. So where you might have, one freelance designer paid on a project, we might use two, so it's like they each have each other as a backup or just to divvy up work with us as well. And in terms of quality, it's like regularly checking in with them, and again, kind of coaching them on the way that we would approach things without being too prescriptive, of course, but making sure that they know how we've done similar things in the past as well. Yeah.
Great. So I think this takes us to the close. There's just a final, I guess, question and comment, and maybe a place that we can leave it. So this question says, are you familiar with social impact entertainment? And references a program at UCLA called Spark. And then really leaving it with this, which is, how do you see the future of business in regards to social impact?
Yeah, well, so social impact entertainment, I'm not sure if I'm familiar with it. I have like a lot of things pop into my mind of what that might mean, but I can tell it's a specific term, that you're bringing up. So I'll definitely look into it, and I'll look into Spark as well. So that's super great. And then the second part was, what do I see the future of business as pertains to social impact, right? Yeah. So I think the future is to have organizations, right? I think at some point, some people might say to have every business be a social enterprise, right? To have every business integrate impact and revenue. And I would say that that's step one to the future that I would hope to see. The other step would be to have every business reflect on the issues that they themselves have been part of creating, right? So for example, I think it was, and I hate to say the wrong brand name, so let me just generalize it. It was a major soda company, right? They advertised that they were going to start making plastic bottles out of plastic waste found in the ocean, right? And that's wonderful, right? But they failed to acknowledge that this particular brand's plastic bottles make up for about like 60 or 70% of the plastic waste in the ocean. Therefore, they created the problem. You know, that's a problem. So what I would hope to see is that businesses take the time to kind of reflect on the issues that they themselves either directly or unknowingly, you know, helped to create, and actually integrate impact initiatives within their models to first and foremost address those so that we can get to some of the more systemic issues, and then do kind of the external facing issues that they are not directly related to necessarily. So I hope like that kind of mindset, which I would call sort of like aiming to be an offset enterprise, right? To kind of offset your own enterprise, you know, can be a direction that we head in as well.
Excellent. Matthew, thank you so much. Such a wide-ranging and useful and relevant conversation. We're very lucky to have you as part of the Art Center community.
Well, thank you, Robbie. This was a great conversation, and thanks to everybody that posted in the Q&A. These were really thoughtful questions as well. So I'm easy to find online. You know, if you want to check out our toolkits, definitely check out reginald.co so you can get some free stuff. And if you have questions, you know, shoot me a DM on Instagram.
Excellent. And we will follow up with everybody with a survey so that you can share your thoughts on today, and mark your calendars for June 23rd, which will be our next webinar with Jose Caballero and Chris Doe. And there'll be more to come, and greatly appreciate everybody being here today, and stay in touch.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Bye, Matthew. Thank you.
Bye. Take care.